welcome to Inverness to the Marine Forum 2019. It's great to see so many of you here. We started a bit late, so I'll do this really quickly. I'll start with some boring details, then Alice will tell you a little bit about today and introduce the speakers to you for session 1. There is no fire alarm scheduled for today, so if the fire alarm goes off, we're going to assume that it's real, and we'll just go out the building to the nearest assembly point, which is just the middle of the car park. If you require any assistance with leaving the building, please do let us know. If you have any questions during anything today, please ask either myself, my name is Marielle, or Alice over here, Katie down there, Ali at the back door over there, Andrew down here, or Nick right next to him down here as well, and we'll be happy to help you and answer any questions you may have. And I think that's everything for the boring details just now. I hope you have a really lovely day, and little word of warning, for the workshop sessions this afternoon, there will again be an air horn.
Hi everybody, I'm Alice from WDC, and I'm just going to introduce our speakers for the first session. We're going to have our keynote speaker, Butler Stroud, and followed by talks from the two host organizations, WDC and SMASS, and then we'll give you another break for coffee and any kind of personal breaks you need to take. So that shouldn't take much more than an hour, so we should get you out for that if you need it. So our first speaker is Butler Stroud, who's the CEO of Whale and Dolphin Conservation.
Thank you very much. Is this microphone working? Can you hear that? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I have to say I was told there was a whole series of things that I wasn't allowed to say. So I wasn't allowed to be political. So as a Welshman speaking in Scotland, welcome to any English people here today. I hope you enjoyed the rugby last weekend. It was St. David's Day, so I'm going to roll back on it. Okay, so what I was asked to think about was what are we learning from whales and dolphins, and then what does that mean in terms of trying to save the world through relationship. And saving the world sounds a little bit like a major thing to take, but why shouldn't we have really good aspirations in terms of what we do? Why shouldn't we think that protecting whales and dolphins actually benefits human beings as well as benefiting whales and dolphins themselves? And so what I'm going to talk about is the role of civil society and public input into science, and then I'm going to drift a little bit and I'll get shouted at by Katie for talking too long, and then we'll pause me. This photo is here, not because it's a photo of me, because it's a photo of Sarah, and it's most probably the only one she would allow me to put up, but I didn't ask her permission, so I get to put her on the screen. It is increasingly important in terms of what we now call citizen science, and how civil society engages with the scientific process. Those of us who have the luxury or the privilege of being able to study and be scientists full time, I say privilege. I'm sure if you're out and it's cold and it's wet and you're out on a boat sometimes, or you're stuck in the lighthouse or whatever, it can sometimes not seem such a privilege. But it is something remarkable that lots of us wish we were able to do. But it's increasingly important, that relationship between the two sides. In terms of taking the science and then converting it, so as an NGO, we're a campaigning organisation that wants to take science, take the work that's done here by you guys and others, and turn it into policy, turn it into ways to advocate. So sometimes it's about storming the barricades, challenging government. Sometimes it's about being the weather vane. Sometimes we have the solutions. Sometimes we can see it in front of us, and sometimes we point to it. Other times it's simply to say there's a problem. So if we go back 30, 40 years when people were starting to talk about global warming and saying there was a problem, that was the weather vane time. Now we see young children trying to storm the barricades because they feel that governments aren't being quick enough in terms of what they're doing. One of the crucial things, there's about 8 points I want to get across in this first session, is there are very few solo conservation superhero efforts out there. Collaboration is increasingly essential. There are a few people who've managed to change the world, I think, in terms of what they did. In terms of Silent Spring, that was amazing in terms of getting people to start thinking about what was happening in the environment. But it was then the collaborative work that took place afterwards that really took that message forward. In all the cases, it's actually sound science and policy that underpins the conservation. You can never really get policy through. There's an elastic relationship between governments, the public, scientists, and the rest of civil society. Sometimes emotion will take us forward, and sometimes the science catches up. Sometimes the science is there and governments actually listen to the science and then put laws into place. But usually it's a dynamic relationship between all of these things. But when the public get involved with delivering science, when we get to go out there and do stuff, it creates a momentum which is different. And that difference is actually starting to have more and more impact. For some, science is political. So I've referred to this, the Japanese government in 2014 lost a case at the International Court of Justice about its whaling in the southern hemisphere in what is called a sanctuary down there under the IWC. And basically they said, look, your science is what you're doing isn't for the purposes of science. So we've had over 30 plus years of hunting of whales, the killing of thousands of whales. And I think in the court case at the end of the day, it revealed that Japan had published maybe three peer-reviewed articles, papers from that piece of work. So it wasn't scientific. The science in this case is used politically. This is from I said I get a little bit political. This is from the Japanese ODA book. This is the Overseas Development Aid book, which Japan uses when it's talking to countries to come and support it for whaling. And if you see here, sharing common goals regarding use of marine resources, developing mutual understanding concerning sustainable use of resources without undue emphasis on conservation. This is a public document, and it's a political document in terms of the instructions that Japanese diplomats have when they're courting countries to engage. And this is where people aren't scared to say that their science is political. But at the same time, we have to recognise that and understand that kind of complexity. From WDC's point of view, and others now, there is a new philosophical underpinning in terms of the way we're thinking about science. So the issue about what we call the ecological whale, we're finding out that whales, cetaceans, are actually critical parts of the ecosystems. We did a calculation several years ago, and there's been a few papers since that looked at how much of the biomass we remove from the oceans. And I think the first time we did it, the calculation was something like we've lost about 80% of the biomass of whales and small cetaceans. We only have about 20% of that biomass left out there. And what the long-term effect of that is, we may only just be seeing, compounded with climate change on top of it. Someone once said to me, well, it's fine, the Japanese want to kill 2,000 whales in Antarctica, and they say there's 500,000. Well, that's contestable in terms of how the surveys are done. But my response to that was, with a loss of 80% of biomass, we actually most probably need 1 million nuclear whales. We most probably need 2 million nuclear whales. We need that ecosystem to be healthy. The other area that we're increasingly starting to understand is that individuals matter. The days where we talked about scientific protection are looking towards protecting populations or species and then subspecies. Increasingly, we're beginning to appreciate that individuals matter. And this is where the work looking at things like culture and social complexity in cetaceans is increasingly important. We're beginning to find out that individuals play a really important role in groups. And we're seeing that exposed in the way that animals behave. So down in Patagonia, a few years ago, there was an orca, a male orca, who had came up to the shore and had a broken jaw. And this is the group that hunt pinnipeds on the shoreline. When we saw him, we thought, actually, yep, there's definitely going to be some, we won't see this whale again. The damage was really extensive. Disappeared for a year. A second year, it actually came back, and what we found was the other orcas were feeding that male orca. So there was a cooperative action within that going on in terms of keeping that individual alive. They valued that individual, and I'm sure that individual valued itself, but there was something going on in that society where that individual was valued. We know increasingly that in certain species, the matriarchal groupings, it's the females that dominate. A bit like real life. That science, that feeling of what was going on, our understanding there is now maturing into understanding more and more about the social lives of animals, in terms of primates, in terms of elephants, in terms of cetaceans, in terms of certain bird species. And several years ago, we went to the Convention on Migratory Species, the Bonn Convention, and said, look, we think you have to start thinking about other ways of listing species, down through the population, down to even cultural division. So populations of sperm whales off the east coast of Latin America. Actually, there are cultural divisions where we have to do different types of conservation management plans for those species. The cultural groupings within the single species. And CMS is reacting to that and has been doing a series of workshops with us and others, looking at how do you start to introduce a cultural element and social complexity into defining how we create conservation going forward. All of that starts to tell us that individuals matter. And are we the first to do this? No, we're not. Back in '82, the UN said every form of life is unique, warranting respect regardless of worth to man, and to accord other organisms such recognition, man must be guided by a moral code. Now, people may say that doesn't sound too scientific, but this again is where we as citizen scientists involved help to mitigate that hard, cold form of science, which you can boo me for. But the reality is, science is political with a small p. It's about how science interacts within society, how we as society then interact with science and interact with policymakers. So there isn't a problem as long as we understand the lens that we're looking through when we're doing this. So again, the lessons we're learning from cetaceans is that individuals matter. And I put this in because this actually is Prime Minister Abe in Japan when he was younger. This is his grandfather. His grandfather was part of the government during the Second World War, actually oversaw part of the invasion of China, was condemned as a war criminal, and then actually the Americans pulled him out of that system and made him Prime Minister. He had a strong nationalistic agenda and oversaw some of the conversion of the original Sino-Japanese fleet into whaling to actually provide revenue for the invasion of China and then to provide food for the troops in China. So for Abe, his relationship with his grandfather, that individual relationship, has dominated his thinking. So when you talk about trying to use science to argue on the issue with Japan, actually that's one part which some people will listen to. But the reality is this long-term relationship that a individual who's now in power had. So for cetaceans, individuals matter. When it comes to instigating policy, individuals matter. And then, of course, whaling becomes nationalism. And when you meet others who are willing to withdraw from international conventions, to withdraw from international rule-based order, it's very easy for countries like Japan to suddenly say, we're going to leave the IWC and hunt whales on our own. Third point, how we do science is important. WDC's strong position is that trying to study whales and dolphins in captivity is really a caricature. You end up with a false study. And I'll note in a moment, we're helping to move 2 belugas from China to a sanctuary in Iceland. And interestingly, as the belugas have now been fattened up, ready for the colder water, they're actually less responsive to instructions from their instructors. So it looks like as the animals get back to what they should be, as natural belugas, they become more independent. And the question therefore is, in captivity, are we artificially keeping these creatures slightly underfed in order to make them do tricks? There's lots of new information coming out of that. How we learn is very important. This is in Japan, Ogata in the south, Kochi Prefecture, and these are young school children going out to see whales for the first time. And one of the problems in Japan, this is the word Japanese for kujara. It's made up of 2 characters, and it means whale. When you're learning kanji in Japan as a youngster, up to the age of about 18, you learn about 1,900 characters overall, 18 of which are animal ones. Kujara isn't one of those. So what you learn is, this first character means fish. So for lots of Japanese children, even the context of how they learn means that they actually end up learning that they think that these are fish, big fish. And it's only later when you can get them out on the boat and actually start to understand that they're marine mammals. And it sounds so obvious to us, but that context in how you learn and how science is transmitted is really important. We can do science with a hammer. This is the hunting of small cetaceans in Japan, and this in the blowhole is a cork. It's only there to actually stop the blood getting into the water so cameras can't see it. Or we can do science with compassion. And here I would say, and this is maybe challengeable, but I would say do not be afraid of similarities and differences between us and those we study. Whales and dolphins are remarkable, and lots of the times we're trying to make them sound like they're human. And there's lots of similarities in certain species. But the other part of it is they are remarkably different. And we should celebrate cetaceans for that difference as much as the similarities. They are incredible creatures, but they don't have to be human to be incredible. They just have to be themselves. I think it was Goodall, when she was studying primates, said one of the problems when she was first doing her thesis was she would see things happening with the primates, she'd write them down, and her supervisor would say, you can't use language which anthropomorphizes them. And after a while, she realized that actually she needed to use some of that language. What she thought she was seeing was jealousy. What she was seeing was grief. And over time, we've increasingly come to understand that actually we can use that language. So from a pure scientific point of view, what was the codex of understanding at the time was you couldn't use that kind of language. But because she came at it from a fresh angle, and the way we can come at it as citizen sciences and those who are concerned about strandings and others, is that we can actually start to say, we can see things that maybe sometimes in purity of science we're trained not to see and submit. I know lots of vets who, interestingly, a vet once said to me recently when we were talking about animal welfare, he said, yeah, you know, my 5 years of vet school and plus training afterwards, they worked really hard to get the welfare part of it taken out. But actually it's afterwards really doing, that was the thing that motivated them as a vet in the first place to get involved. Science, of course, is empirical, but science is also about understanding how these things fit into society. We've come a long way. This is the 1990s. This is a dolphin down on the Cornish coast. It's been butchered for meat. And in fact, one of my colleagues' parents was offered some of the meat from this dolphin because she was Norwegian. And the local fisherman that had done this thought that she would fancy some dolphin. We've come a long way from that. Now, for example, this is working with a company used to be called Sea Life, it's now Merlin Entertainments. This is what you get when you get a Welshman, an Icelander, this lady here, and a bloke from Sheffield, James, they are now committed to actually building sanctuaries around the world for whales and dolphins that have been in captivity. They've just invested about 7 million in this project, and the 2 belugas that are in Shanghai will be flown to a location up in Iceland about the 13th of April, we're hoping, depending on flight times and weather, air routes of thing. The company there was Cargolux. They're donating about £500,000 worth of support to actually get those 2 whales there. And these 2 whales are changing a whole industry. Again, individuals matter. That's the other thing I want to say here. It's a lot of money for 2 whales. But if we can establish that actually the world has to change, the captive display industry has to change, we're not trying to say SeaWorld stop business tomorrow. What we're saying is you just need to change your business, start protecting whales and dolphins in situ, and get your whales and dolphins back out into ocean pens, and those that can be released should be. Carefully managed, but they should be. Just to show things aren't always right, this is, and I put this in because we're in Scotland, this is the Nightjar restaurant and bar in London from 2014. And if you can't see it, I'm pointing at this. This is called a Moby Dick, and it is a certain type of non-Speyside whiskey, which has whale infusion. From the name of the drink, you can imagine which part of the whale was infused into the whiskey. Luckily, we found this. We're able to bring it to the attention of the Metropolitan Police, and now we work alongside Metropolitan Police, actually in partnership and collaboration, to actually look at any of these cases that have come up now. 5, partnerships. Sometimes you need to dance with the one that brought you. I was told not to mention the word Brexit, so I'm not going to say Brexit. This minister has just stepped down over Brexit. It's a personal choice of his. You can agree or you can disagree. Actually, when it came to cetaceans, he was actually quite progressive. But it doesn't matter. When we're delivering science and policy, we are apolitical in terms of how we engage. So sometimes, as Shania Twain would say, you have to dance with one that brought you. Working together with friends is critical. So this is part of the work at the moment where groups have come together in terms of the UK-wide looking at animal welfare. And sometimes we need to be critical friends. So this is WDC, BirdLife International, RSPB, looking at the issue of the MSC scheme in terms of how they deal with bycatch. Friendships and collaboration doesn't mean that you agree all the time. It means that you can be a critical friend. And we have to be critical friends sometimes. This last bit, in the last 2 minutes, I just say about bringing all of it together into individuals, what we're learning, is a tale of Billy, Kelly and John. John Locke was a philosopher, and he once said that actually there's a thing, psychological continuity. And we're beginning to understand that there's more going on in these guys' brains than we ever thought. Psychological continuity means you have some understanding of the past, some understanding of today, and potentially understanding of tomorrow. This is Billy. Some of you may know Billy down in Adelaide. She was once taken into captivity for a few weeks when she got caught in a bay area. She wasn't taught to do any tricks. Once she got back out to set free, she actually started doing tail walks, and she had seen tail walks being done by other dolphins. We've looked at this for several years. We thought it might be a fad. It's actually spread to other females. Males don't seem to do it, females do it. We cannot find any reason why they'd want to do it. They don't need to perform. Billy was quite a dominant female. She didn't need to attract any other mates. The only thing that seems to be happening is she's having fun. And that has been passed on to others. Kelly, I think, is also a famous dolphin from the US in Mississippi. This is the dolphin that was found to collect rubbish at the end of the day in a tank, in a concrete tank. She'd pick up pieces of rubbish. Kelly, for some reason, Kelly was getting much more rewards than anybody else. And what they did was, once they started looking at her, was they found that Kelly was actually taking bits of paper or plastic bag and ripping it up into small bits, and then bringing individual bits. So what was Kelly doing? Kelly was able to see the situation in terms of that reward for the action, was able to think what may happen if she did something, did it, and then take it forward. Now, maybe I'm romanticising that, but I like to think that that's Kelly doing a bit of math, most probably better than my GCSE maths. You can't keep a good sedation down. You never know how important one whale or dolphin is. When you're at strandings and all that work you do, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But that individual that you get off the beach, back out to sea, could be critical to the long-term survival of that population. So always think as you're doing it, it's always worth it. Never, it sometimes doesn't work, but it is worth it for all the other ones that are out there. In closing on this, citizen science began some time ago. This wasn't the first. I took part in Galaxy Zoo back in about 2008. It's been going for quite a while now, and it's spawned a huge number of other citizen science projects. But it reminded me, thinking about this, about where this is one of my other passions lies. The last thing really in closing on this is that long-term studies are important. The time that you commit to this collaboration in understanding what's going on is really important. This is the study of Nick, for a photo from David Haynes. I'm not sure if David's here. David's over there. And you can see from 2010 and 2019 that long-term study is what works. And it's really hard trying to get sponsors and donors and things to understand that actually 10, 20, 30 years of work is critical. But what you help contribute fulfills that, fleshes that out, takes it forward, and gives some understanding and commitment. And it's not just that you're committed to those individual dolphins. Citizen science allows communities to get involved in projects and understanding and take control of how science is used to protect them. And sometimes it's not that cold calculating numbers game that may happen with governments. It's actually the reality of what you want to happen in that protection, for protection of those species close to shore. So, my last slide, the last point I would say is, and like them, please keep having fun doing it. We may not all be there to solve the equations of DNA or to find the cure for cancer or whatever, but what we do will have a long-term benefit, not just for these guys, but for us as human beings, because with them thriving, with our oceans thriving, we stand a chance of actually having an incredible planet which we can share with them going forward. Thank you very much.
So just as Chris hands over the microphone, I'm going to say that we have a time at the end for all of our panelists to come back, and as Chris has just highlighted on partnership and critical discussion, if you could keep your questions to that time. There's a pen in your bag, so you can feel free to write them down, but that way we can get a mixed discussion on answers to those. Also, all of our speakers have, of course, agreed to be very available to you during coffee and lunchtime if you have individual questions at that point. And so, without further ado, I'm going to introduce the infamous Andrew from SMASS, who will come up and give